child who was in or is in prison?
Have I ever had to help a child? Yes, I have. Back before I worked in the school system as a social worker, I worked in substance abuse and addiction and mental health counseling centers. Sometimes the kids that I worked with were living there, getting treatment and help. Sometimes they were living at home and just coming into the centers for counseling groups and support. But many times, mental health and substance abuse problems, there are children who are also incarcerated in jail for lengths of time due to either those offenses or maybe assaults or breaking and entering or things like that. So there are oftentimes I've come across kids that have been in and out, or they have a parole officer, which means they've been in a prison already, or they're working with a probation officer at the time. So a lot of times the prison and detention centers work very closely with the treatment centers.
In the book that we are reading in class, the kids are into bad things like gangs, drugs, and violence. These kids are involved in a trial for robbery and murder. What personal qualities do you think that social workers need to have for this job that you are working with troubled kids with?
You have to have a lot of compassion. You have to have a lot of empathy, because a lot of times your clients or the kids or families you're working with have made some pretty bad choices. Maybe they've had crimes where there are victims of their crimes. Not all crimes have victims, but a lot of them do. So I have worked with people where it's a kind of a fine line. It's hard to have that compassion and empathy when they've done things that you don't agree with and go against your value system. So you kind of have to treat the person as where are they going to go from here? You know, you have to know their past to help them, but you're also trying to help build skills and teach them things that will help them move on with their life. So a lot of compassion, a lot of empathy, non-judgment. Yeah.
All the people that talk on trial in our book Monster greatly impact the jury's decision. When helping kids in court, does your opinion weigh heavily on the jury's eyes?
Yes. Back when I was working in a different state, I worked in a substance abuse and mental health treatment center, where in the town that I was working in, they had something called a youth drug court. I'm not sure if you're familiar with youth drug courts. It's essentially giving drug and alcohol offenders a chance to get rehabilitation outside of the prison and jail system, where they will have a probation officer, they'll do drug testing, they'll have counseling, they'll have family counseling, they'll have mental health counseling, they'll see doctors to get their health up. They will work closely with the teachers at school, in a school system or an alternative school system. And then as we all work with them, there are times when we do have to go to court. And I do remember going to court with one particular young man one time, where my testimony of how he has stayed clean and sober, how he has been getting good grades in school, how he has been passing all of his tests and things like that. I had to go testify in the court trying to help him graduate from drug court, which means he wasn't being monitored by all of the people in that system anymore. There's been other times when I've had kids who have had DUIs, or they've got caught with drug paraphernalia, like pipes and things like that. And I've had them in counseling groups or one-on-one counseling, and then they have to go for a court hearing to see how they're doing. And there are often times where I've had to testify and let the courts know how they're doing. So I do think that social workers have a strong voice in the court system and do have an influential role. Yeah.
In our book Monster, we have a 16-year-old boy who probably needs a social worker. He is involved in a court case where he is being tried on whether or not he is involved in an armed robbery. Have you ever been involved in a court case like this? If so, what role did you take? If not, what role would you take?
Okay. The young man that I spoke about that was in the drug court system, he and his brother actually were involved in a robbery. It was not an armed robbery, but it was a breaking and entering type of situation. And then they also were under the influence of drugs at the time. So I have not particularly been involved in an armed robbery case, but I have worked with kids who have had those kind of offenses where they have, stole things from school, or they've broken into businesses, or they have broken into cars, things like that. And a social worker's role in all of that would be, like I said, a lot of times people that are involved in the criminal justice system also suffer from some mental issues and possibly substance abuse, drug and alcohol issues. So a social worker at that time could function either as a counselor, giving them, the skills they need to make changes. A social worker could also function as an advocate for them, being a voice for them, a voice to the courts or to the probation officers that they are making changes, they are working hard, or sometimes, unfortunately, you have to tell the courts that they are not making changes, and I've had to do that side too, where they're not passing their drug tests, they are not going to school. I've had to go both ways, but they could also be, like I said, a voice of teaching them new skills, being an advocate for them, or managing all those different things that they have to do. A lot of times social workers are case managers, and case managers are, they're working with the kid, but they're also communicating with the family. They're also communicating with the school. They're communicating with the probation officer, with the drug counselor. They're trying to take, the whole kid's life into perspective and make sure that they have what they need in all of those areas. So.
In your book, Monsters, Steve Harmon, or Mr. Harmon, gets involved with Steve's predicament emotionally. Have you helped a child that had their parents come see you as well?
Have I helped it? Yes. Oh, yes. A lot of times social workers don't just work with kids, they work with families as well. Especially, in schools, there's sometimes when I talk to kids' parents, and that's often the case, usually over the phone or email, but sometimes they will come in and we will all sit down together and work together. But quite often when you're working in a community-based counseling center, social workers have, they do counseling in different ways. They will work with the kid individually, one-on-one, or they may work with kids as a group. And then a lot of times families will, there will be a family component where they will be providing either education to the families about parenting or, skills to help their own child who's suffering. Or you may be working doing some family counseling. So that's often the case.
In our book, we have some criminals in court that are known to be dangerous because they're involved in an armed robbery. Anything can happen in court. Somebody could act out and go crazy. They could harm somebody, such as the judge or defendant, or anybody for that matter. Have you ever been put in danger due to your job?
I have one time, and it wasn't with a youth. It was with a probably 30-year-old woman. I was doing an assessment on her. She had received a DUI, and I was assessing whether she, in fact, did have what kind of substance abuse problem she had, and I had determined that she did have a substance abuse problem, and I had to tell her that I was recommending that she go to drug and alcohol treatment for her problem. And someone had asked earlier whether we have a strong voice in the court system, and for at this particular point in my career when I was working in that role, what we recommended as the professionals, as licensed substance abuse therapists and licensed social workers, what we recommended was oftentimes the court, they listened to us, they heard what we said, and if we recommended that one of our clients needed to go to treatment, that was what they needed to do. And then the burden was on them to prove why they didn't have to go. Okay, so they did have that option. But I had to tell her that I recommended that, and she was suffering, from alcoholism and mental illness. She threw a very large book at my face. Luckily, I kind of got out of the way, and I was very fortunate fortunate because when you're working in a setting like that, those kind of things could happen at any time, you're right. And fortunately that our agency that I was working with, we had a lot of protocol, we had a lot of training and plans should things like that happen. So there was a certain code, certain button I could push on my phone that would alert the front desk that I needed help. And we always were very careful that we situated our desks and our chairs in a location in our offices, because you're giving your clients confidentiality and you're giving your clients privacy. So you're usually in the closed room with them, with the door closed. But we always made sure that we situated our desks and our chairs in a place that we could exit the room quickly if we needed to, because there are times when people are suffering and they're not in a mental state, or their brain is impaired by substance abuse, and they do make those kind of quick reactions or impulsive decisions, and they can become angry and violent. So that did happen to me once, where I did have a book, but I've never had a weapon pulled. Thank goodness. I've never been really hit with anyone's fists or anything like that, so I'm very fortunate.
Steve Harmon is a black 16-year-old accused of murder with a jury that has already been convinced that he is guilty. He is faced with the challenge of nobody believing he's innocent. As a social worker, when dealing with kids, does it ever get hard to see them as innocent when all evidence points to guilty?
When you're working with kids, that is hard, because as a social worker, like I said, you have that compassion, you have that empathy, but above all else, you value community safety. So there are times when, even though the person has only been alive and in our world for a short number of years compared to an older adult, there are times when they still make very unfortunate and very unsafe choices and commit crimes that have victims. So it is hard sometimes to separate that. To answer your question, there are times when you have to kind of set that aside and, like I said earlier, just keep focusing on their future and keep trying to build skills to give them a better life than what they have had so far. But that is hard when you have bigger factors playing into that.
The prosecutor in our book tries to accomplish the right thing to do to bad people. What do you hope to accomplish as a social worker?
As a social worker, my main thing that I hope to accomplish as a social worker, and this is, I'm speaking from a frame of reference of working in a school, but also similar things when I was not working in a school, when I was working in more community-based programs. Number one, you just want to build a relationship with kids. You want them to trust you and feel genuine with them, and you want them to have that feeling that you care about them no matter what. Because oftentimes kids, I think, get the message that they don't have a voice, they don't have an opinion, they don't matter, they're just, they don't have any say in things. So oftentimes I want to try to build and establish a close relationship with them and get that trust. And then once you have that, it's easier to talk with them about some of the negative behaviors they're doing or the issues that aren't so much fun to talk about. And then once you have that level of trust in that relationship, it's easier to help them build the skills they need.
Steve does not have a social worker, but in many situations they usually are able to get help from a social worker. Do you like being a social worker? Why or why not?
I do like being a social worker. I've been a social worker for many years, and I always knew when I was growing up that I wanted to do something working with teenagers or little kids. I just wasn't sure what it was. And as I got into college, I learned more about social work and decided to go into that. It's a hard job. It's not always rewarding, especially when you're working with kids like the character of your story. Oftentimes when they're issues, and then they're being raised in that environment. And then by the time they're adolescents, they have, you know, all of the growth and development that you guys all go through, coupled with putting drugs or alcohol in their body, peer pressure, hanging around the wrong crowd, maybe some depression, anxiety going on. That's a very complicated individual to work with when they've been experiencing these things for most of their lives. Therefore, it's very hard. Sometimes you don't see them making all the changes that you want them to make in the long term. Oftentimes they can make changes in the short term, but once they get out of the system or back with their friends or their peer group or gangs or even with their family sometimes, those old patterns come back very quickly, and then they find themselves back in the same position. So a lot of times you see those repeat offenders. So the rewards are sometimes very short term. Sometimes you don't get that kid that's made a whole, you know, who's truly made changes and has gone on to do great things when you're working in the juvenile justice system. A lot of times they're in and out, in and out, in and out, and it's just a big cycle that repeats over and over. But working as a social worker in a school with all of you lovely faces here, it is much more rewarding. You guys are, you know, you're fun, getting to know you and seeing you guys grow. I think you guys were second graders or first graders when I met you. So I've enjoyed, you know, seeing you guys grow up and see who you become and what sports and clubs you get into and how you do and things like that. And I'm very proud of all the things you've done today. So working in a school as a social worker is much more rewarding than working in the juvenile justice system.
So since Steve doesn't have a social worker, but in many cases there is, like, has a kid like ever affected like how you feel about life and how you like and what decisions you make in life?
So
Like influenced your life?
has a child ever influenced my life? Oh, sure, many times. There are still kids that I, you know, 15 years ago that I work with. And in fact, you know, when I woke up this morning and I'm thinking about doing this interview for you, and I'm trying to go back in my mind to when I worked with this population a lot more in previous jobs, you know, there were probably 2 or 3 that really kept popping up in my mind. And this was when I was working in another state with them. I was not in Illinois, and I oftentimes wonder and think about them. And you know, there's just certain things you hear, or certain music you hear, or a song you hear, or just a name, or just reminiscing about old times, and it does bring those kids up in my mind, and I do wonder about them, and I wonder what happened to them, where are they now? And then when I was working here in Illinois at Chestnut Health System, I was working in the residential program where kids come to live there for probably up to 3 months because they're having substance abuse problems, and there's quite a few kids there that I think about often too, and I wonder what happened to them. What kind of adults are they? Will I ever run into them again someday? So they do impact me in that way, and they also impact me in ways where you worry about them. You know, there's times when I go home from my job here in Hayworth where I go home at night and I worry about kids and what kind of life they're going home to, or if they're going to be safe that night, or they're going to show back up at school today. And there is a sense of relief when I see them walk through the doors and know that they are safe and made it back to school. So oftentimes our social workers take our work home with them. I'm fortunate where I live in Bloomington. I know it's not that far of a drive, but there's many times when I have to just leave my stress behind and really process it in my brain on my drive home, so when I get home to my own family, I can give them the best side of me. Otherwise, if you don't have something to decrease your stress and worry, it really probably could start impacting your own family life. So,
When you were in court before, did you ever have to put someone you were close with in jail?
I have had to testify to a negative drug screen in a court. When you go to court, a lot of times kids are in the system and they're on probation or parole, and they have to go back in for court dates frequently, where the judges are monitoring their case, the probation officers are monitoring them. So a lot of times, counselors, social workers, teachers, people that are working with them have to go in there and give an update to the court about how they're doing. So there have been many times where I have had to go in and say, they're not going to school, they're not getting good grades, they're fighting at home, they're using drugs still, they're not showing up for their counseling sessions. And a lot of times judges or probation officers or parole officers will kind of revoke their right to be living in the community and put them in jail for a certain amount of time. So yes, I have had to testify, and that's happened before.
Do you feel like you work more with adults, young children, or teenagers?
Is the question which one I prefer working with,
Which
or
one do you feel like you work most with?
as a social worker? Okay. In the juvenile justice system, I work mainly with the kids themselves in terms of maybe a teenage level. There were times in my career where I worked with maybe that population of like 18 to 25-year-olds, the college kids, because the town I was working in was a major university was there. So oftentimes I work with the college age students as well. And really they say that our brains are developing until we're about 24 years old anyway. So a lot of times, you know, they're still adolescents in a way, even though they're in their 20s. So I probably would say that I work with, in my career in the justice system, probably, you know, I've had kids as young as 12 in there, up to college age mainly. I've had experience working with adults when I worked in a DUI, drug and paraphernalia type misdemeanor program. So I've done those groups. Here at Hayworth, I primarily work in the grade school. So right now, I'm primarily in a pre-K through 6th grade, working with that age group. But most of my other professional life outside of working at the grade school has been with teenagers.
In our book, Steve has made comments about suicide. Have you ever been involved with a suicidal case?
Many times. It was very sad. I have been involved with suicidal people my whole career. It doesn't matter if you're working in a juvenile justice system, a substance abuse, mental health facility, or a school. Suicide has been one thing I've unfortunately had to deal with many times, because, as we have said, having problems with the courts, having problems with drugs and alcohol, depression and anxiety and things like that often are intertwined. They're intertwined together. So yes, I have had experience where I've had to call the crisis team to come, and a crisis team is a place, a group of individuals that are specifically trained in assessing whether someone needs to be hospitalized or not for suicidal thoughts or gestures. So I've had to call them a few times, and that's including, you know, here in our town here. And then there's also been times when I've had kids living in treatment centers who have been on suicide watch, where we've had to really restrict and watch them very closely throughout the day and night. So yes, I've had, and I've dealt with that.
That's it.
Probably left off on that question.
Thank you.
You said it's sad you left off with that one?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's one that really touches us all personally, especially lately here in our town, so.
You know what, I got one other question.
You have one more?
Yeah, has there ever actually been even a really bad crime you've been in besides the robbery?
When working with the youth, have I ever had anyone that's committed something more than a robbery?
Like, has there ever been a crime that's worse than that you've been in?
Yes, there has been. There's been molesting, rape, crimes that have victims. Yeah, I've worked with that. That's really hard. Really hard.
Yeah. Do you think that's like your toughest thing to work with?
Yes, indeed.
Steve, like in the book, it talks about
Sexual harassment in
Yeah.
prison. Would you have anything to do with that? Like, as far as your job goes, like helping
victims to get them back strong again and support and counsel them because, like I said, it's very hard to have compassion for someone that's committing a crime that goes against your own value system. And I really, have great admiration and great honoring of the social workers that work with those toughest criminals who commit those crimes and trying to help them and rehabilitate them. When we talked about, having a rewarding career, that probably wouldn't be very rewarding for them. But yes, I have worked, to answer his question, with people who have done things to other people that go against what I believe in, and it's very hard.
Thank you for listening.
You are welcome. Anything else?
No.
No?